Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, another IHRB webinar where we'll be discussing the challenges faced by women when migrating for work. Today, we're also launching two important pieces of research on this topic. One is a short report for business on women migrant workers and the issue of responsible recruitment, and also a gender review of the DACA principles for migration with dignity, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Marilyn Krause from Fair Square, who is actually the lead researcher for both reports, and will be able to talk us through some of the key findings and recommendations, and also by Sumita Krishna, who is the founder and director of Our Journey, a civil society working with migrant workers in Malaysia, and also Anne Abunda, a migrant worker herself, and also a founder of Sandigan Kuwait, which is a civil society organization promoting worker welfare and the rights of migrant workers in Kuwait. But before we go into the discussions, this is a friendly reminder to send your questions. There is a little Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So keep them coming, and we'll have time at the end to go through some of these questions. So Sumita, Marilyn, and thanks so much for being here with us today. It's a real pleasure to have you here, especially to celebrate also International Women's Day tomorrow. And Marilyn, I'll start straight with you. Can we talk a little bit about the key findings of the research that you undertook in collaboration with IHRB and the main challenges that you identified that women are facing prior, during recruitment, during employment, and then also once they go back to their countries of origin? And if you could talk a little bit about how this experience is different from the experience of men who are migrating for work as well.
Sure. Thanks, Julia, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Just to briefly introduce Fair Square, we're a small human rights advocacy and research organisation based in London. Migration and labour migration and the rights of people who migrate for work is one of our thematic focus areas. And we've previously carried out research on this topic in a project called the 5 Corridors, which looked at what governments can do to ensure fair recruitment of migrant workers in 5 migration corridors: Myanmar, Thailand, Nepal, Kuwait, Nepal, Qatar, Philippines, Taiwan, and Mexico, Canada. And if you're interested in that work, then have a look on our website, or if you want to follow up directly with me if you have any specific questions. So the work that we did for IHRB very much builds on that work, on that project. And we were delighted to be able to take part in this project, and just to say a thank you to IHRB for commissioning us. So the key findings from the work, the report has 3 key sections. So we look at the challenges for women migrant workers at the various stages of the migration journey. We look at the protections that are or are not there for them in international law and in international standards. And we make some recommendations for business, because obviously that's the focus of this particular report. So on the challenges then, women migrant workers face challenges at all stages of the process, all stages of their migration journey. Pre-departure and during recruitment, they're often unable to access reliable information, either due to literacy issues or because their gender restricts them in going to speak to people who would be able to share that information with them. They also tend to experience greater financial hardships associated with recruitment fees and the associated costs of migration, because they start off with generally lower assets than men and more limited access to financing for migration. At the destination, women enter a gendered labour market, which which restricts access to certain jobs or promotes them to go into certain types of work, which tends to be lower paid, lower status. People will be familiar with that already. Domestic work, work in factories. They tend to experience workplace restrictions on freedom of movement and restrictions on freedom of movement more generally. They encounter wage inequality, so they're lower paid than male counterparts who are doing the same work. They can experience gender-based violence, including in the workplace, which can range from assaults to harassment by supervisors, by managers. They experience intersectional discrimination, so their gender intersects with identity factors such as race, nationality, their migration status. And of course, and I think this is sometimes often forgotten, there's the psychological toll that migrant workers can experience being separated from their families, including their children, and the burden on people of being an earner for who a large number of people back at home are relying on. So it's a significant psychological burden as well. And as I said, I think that's sometimes perhaps not recognised in the way it should be. On returning home, they can experience discrimination again because they've broken gender norms by leaving, by doing different types of work. They can also find themselves without assets or without property, and they can then be, immediately forced effectively to remigrate in order to find work once again. So briefly then on the protections, or sadly the lack of protections, governments are largely failing to protect women migrant workers. International conventions and frameworks on migrant workers generally do not address gender. Exceptions are the Violence and Harassment Convention, which does include a definition of gender-based violence. The Migrant Workers Convention applies to all migrant workers regardless of gender, but there's no specific gender lens in there. Thinking more broadly, CEDAW applies to all women regardless of their migration status. So there are a few exceptions, but generally there are a lot of gaps. In terms of individual government action, origin countries which rely on remittances are generally reluctant to interfere with the migration system. They don't regulate recruitment effectively. Sometimes what we've seen are bans imposed on women migrating, which actually exposes women to greater risks because they tend to attempt to migrate anyway. They're doing it through more informal channels, and therefore it's more dangerous. Destination states, which in the 5 corridors we found are best positioned to regulate migration, tend to adopt a national security approach. So migrants are often framed as a security issue. Labour laws often exclude women migrant workers. So a huge number of domestic workers, I think it's around 15 million people, most of them are women, not all of them, but most of them are excluded from labour laws internationally. They're just not in the picture. So it's a huge gap. So therefore, there's a huge role for business and a very, very important role for business to step up and work to protect women. There are a couple of IOM and ILO programs that are bringing together different stakeholders, including business, to provide some guidance on actions that businesses can take, and we detail those in the report. And of course, we've now just done the review of the Dakar principles, putting a gender lens in there, which I think it was a fascinating exercise and makes the Dakar Principles an even more valuable resource now. So I would obviously recommend that people take a look at the revised version. So what can businesses do? So it's about proactive engagement and it's about due diligence, which can have positive impact on company reputation. Conversely, failing to address the issues can have significant legal ramifications and, of course, potentially very serious consequences for business reputation. Increasingly as well, in public procurement processes, there is an expectation that businesses are showing what they're doing to ensure rights are respected in the supply chain. So that's another motivating factor, if you like, for business action. So what can businesses do? Carrying out human rights due diligence on supply chains to understand where migrant workers are present and having disaggregated data on a gender basis, looking at company policies and procedures to see whether they're gender sensitive, to see whether they're addressing the specific challenges that face women migrant workers, and gender sensitive human rights risk assessments. Investment in recruitment costs. At the moment, workers are generally paying. That shouldn't be happening. So a commitment to the employer pays principle. Simplifying recruitment, carrying out checks on agencies if they're used, and working with others in the supply chain to address recruitment issues, because as we know, it's complex. Key, really essential, providing decent work for women migrant workers, work that is properly paid, work that has, is in line with labour rights standards. And employing more women as managers and supervisors. And of course, finally, and again, we know this, but establishing accessible grievance mechanisms which bear in mind the particular challenges that women migrant workers might face in attempting to access remedy. So I'll stop there and allow others to comment. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Marilyn. You touched on a number of points that I want to go back to in a second. But before I do that, I think it's really important that we have Anne with us here today, because Anne, your views and your experience is quite unique in this panel. You can bring the perspective of someone who's running a civil society organization and seeing lots of cases on a day-to-day basis, but you're also a migrant worker yourself. So what Marilyn talked about is the theory, right? As the research is what we can find in other reports and online materials, etc., and through interviews. But I would love to hear from you how this actually plays out in practice, in real life.
Hi everyone, good morning. So actually on the ground, there's a lot of challenges that we are encountering, especially the Bangladeshi workers, the women. Aside from the labor violations that they are encountering, there are other violations as well, like the physical, sexual abuses and other forms of abuses. We also need to take note that asserting our rights is very challenging, especially in the country of destination, which resulted, because of the challenges that they encountered in asserting their rights, it resulted to workers to become undocumented. And once they are undocumented, they can, they are already susceptible and vulnerable to be victimized by other stakeholders or other like employers or agencies, recruitment agencies. And most of them doesn't want to go back home. So because of the support, lack of support. So they are afraid that when they go back home, there's no support. How can they start? So there's a lot of things. One of the problem also here is there is no freedom of movement. So because we are under kafala system, there's no freedom of association. So for organizations, for communities to organize, it's against the law here. So I think I have some recommendations actually. The principle is really good. The principle is really good. Although, as what Julia said, it's theory. But to make it stronger, I think they need to include it into the bilateral agreement and to make sure that someone from the civil society organization or communities or groups or can be involved in that in the process. Not in the actual signing, but at least being consulted, which is really, really important. We need to understand as well the kafala system, the sponsorship system. It's not only the domestic workers law or the labor law that we need to be aware of. We need also to be aware of the immigration law, which is really important, And it should be included in the post-arrival or the pre-departure orientation. It needs to be included there. I saw a lot of good things with regards to the visa, to make sure that the visa of the worker is with the employer. But we need to understand that when you arrive here in Kuwait, you are under an entry visa. And we are starting to talk about this, that we point it out many years ago that this is the culprit. Because it becomes the starting point of human trafficking when you arrive in the country of destination. Of course, the ratification of conventions, very important. It should be mandatory to all country of origin, the labor sending countries. It needs to be mandatory because how can you push the country of destination government if you yourself, you are not ratifying it, you are not putting first security and protection for your community or workers. Government agencies that regulates recruitment agencies. We need this. We need a government agency that will regulate the recruitment agencies, because if none, we encountered a lot of cases that they arrive here paying 3,000 KD. Imagine, for a salary of 60 KD only. For a salary of 60 KD, and they need to pay for 3,000 KD, and it means that they need to stay 10 years here in Kuwait without going home. Just to pay for that certain amount. Accountability for government agencies, to the government themselves by not ratifying it. Why? Why not ratifying the convention? It is, not putting in place laws that will protect migrant workers. Accountability to recruitment agencies. They need to put a higher higher penalties, and the country of origin and country of destination recruitment agencies should both be liable to the worker. It should be a joint liability. It's not the worker, it's not only the government, it's not only the employer, but as well as especially the recruitment agencies. And we need to put accountability as well with the embassies, because they are here. They are supposed to be the one pushing for the rights of the constituents, especially when it comes to talks regarding the violations. They are the one handling cases. I hope they have their own case handlers in the embassies. So I think these are the things that needs to be considered as well, in line with the principles that Marilyn stated. Thank you so much, Julia.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you for your very important points. I'll go back to some of them on accountability and government responsibility as well in a second, but you mentioned the civil society needs to be involved, and I think this is so important. It's also a point that is made in the report, also from a business perspective, engaging with civil society and the government. Sumitha, what does that look like in practice? What does meaningful, good consultation and engagement with civil society looks like? Are there any good examples, or what do we know should be avoided?
Thank you for having me on this panel. I think in terms of civil society, of course, there is, as we all know, there is always the mistrust between civil society, companies, government. And I don't think that we have addressed that fully. But there are instances where we have worked with companies in building that trust. And I feel that that comes to the fact that we are trying to resolve the issues internally with the company rather than naming and shaming or exposing the country, because we also take into the consideration of what the worker wants. So from my experience, most of the time, the worker wants us to resolve the issue, but by allowing them to also continue to work in the company. You know, and in terms of women, what we have found, like what Marilyn has also rightly pointed out, there are many reasons why women migrate. You know, she mentioned about poverty and employment, but we also see women migrating because of sexual harassment back home, domestic violence, you know, forced marriages, so on and so forth. And these women, when they migrate and they come to the country of destination, they are less likely to report abuses. It might be a psychological aspect of it because they have already faced those kind of abuses back home. And when they come to this country and face a similar abuses, it's kind of normalized. So they don't feel that they should you know, complain about abuses that they face in the country of destination. And we also find that they take longer to report because they are already there's already a perception that if you complain about the abuse or exploitation that you face, then the next minute you will be deported. You either may get some compensation or you may get some redress in the country of destination, but ultimately you will be deported. So that means that the woman is going back to the same abusive situation that she was back home. So this is why we see that women tend to not report exploitation, or they will remain in that exploitative situation. So these are things that we point out to the companies that we work with to say that you need to have an avenue for women to come forward to report cases of sexual harassment in the workplace safely, and not having the ultimate redress being that you need to be going home, you know. And we also find that a lot of them do not go into the grievance mechanisms of the companies because there are maybe inadequate female participation in that grievance mechanism. Maybe the HR is still a male, or maybe the supervisor is still a male, and they're not able to open up and share their experiences. So this is why we always say that, you know, in terms of women, you must understand what the women went through back home, the culture that they come from, but we also must understand how to address their grievance that they have in the country of destination. I think that's extremely important for companies, and that's what we work in terms of women migrants in Malaysia. Having said that, of course, the company will also come out in defense, in the sense that they say that, you know, we have this gender sensitized environment, and everyone is gender sensitized. There is no sexual harassment and all that. So that kind of, if you keep repeating that kind of you know, to the workers, and say that everybody here is equal and all that, but then in reality it does not happen, then the woman will definitely close down as well. So we have had instances where the company had a policy of no sexual, zero tolerance against sexual harassment and all that, but in reality there was a lot of instances of harassment that the workers were facing, but were not able to voice out to the companies. And I feel in these kind of circumstances, the company needs to think out of the box and have that kind of avenues that although you have a zero tolerance policy, you still need that avenue for the worker to come and report. And it need not be just against a fellow worker or a supervisor. It may be a third party contractor or someone that is coming into the you know, visiting into the premises. So these are some of the situations that we see in terms of women. Collaboration is extremely important, like what you mentioned, Julia, and also Anne. It's so important because I think we are able to communicate better with the workers, because we understand their culture back home. We understand the stigma that they face back home, and the problems that they face back home. And I think they see us as a neutral party. The workers see us as a neutral party, and they're able to open up better to speak with us. So that is why I think that kind of collaboration with civil society, and even of course the trade union, is important in facing situations of migrant workers, women migrant workers. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Sumita. I'm glad you touched on grievance mechanisms. We had a question in the chat about that. I guess if you could talk a little bit about those concepts. So when we talk about forced labor, human trafficking, modern slavery, I feel that one of the challenges is also to reconcile how those concepts translate for workers, and then how it translates in a grievance mechanism or in a conversation with a company or with government. We know that some of the main challenges faced by workers are, for example, withholding of wages, or what some people call wage theft. And that is not always recognized by a worker as forced labor, right? It's simply someone keeping their wages. And so they might be reluctant to report a case of forced labor. So what can business, civil society, and governments do more or better to engage with this more mundane concepts of vulnerability that are not talked about enough?
Sorry, is this questions to me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. In terms of wage theft, one of the situations that we find is actually workers don't understand recruitment fees. When you ask them, did you pay any recruitment fees? They'll automatically tell you, no, I didn't pay anything, because they don't understand the concept, because it has been blurred so much in the country of origin that they don't know that what they're paying is actually recruitment cost. And so when we work with companies on remediation, for example, we have to actually break down what cost at the worker. So we'll ask the worker, so how did you find the recruiter, and can you start from the beginning, and when did you meet him? Did you pay to go to his house? What did he take? What money did he take? We don't use the word recruitment cost at all. We don't even use the word fees, because that means nothing to the worker. So we just tell them that, how did you give money? Did you put it in the bank? And then you can map out the cost that the workers pay. But I can tell you that the women pay more because of the fact that from our studies that we have done with women, or the interviews that we've done with women back home in country of origin don't have access to information about migration. Either they don't have a phone, or they got very restricted access to phone, or they even have very restricted in movement to obtain the kind of information about migration. So they rely on whoever they can get, the recruiter most of the time, and the information they get is not enough, right? And so and they do not know about the cost, so they will just pay whatever the recruiter asks them to. But at the same time, they will pay a much higher cost, especially when they are in that desperate situation, when they're trying to escape a patriarchal system, a sexual harassment, or domestic violence. We see that they want to pay the money to get out of the country as soon as possible. And those kind of recruitment are much higher in cost than normal recruitment costs. So these women, when they come to the country of destination, then they will have to pay back that cost. They take longer time to earn that money, But at the same time, they also have to look after their families back home. So when we find that women also remit more money than men, because their responsibilities are more back home. And for sometimes for men, it may just be a wife, children. But then for women, I find that they do go to an extended family, parents, in-laws, and then the brothers' children, or maybe the sister's children. There's so many extended family that they have to look after. So when it comes to wage, they get the wage, but then it's not enough. At the same time, they don't have the opportunity of overtime. A lot of the companies here rather not give women overtime. They would rather give a man overtime because of the security reasons, or maybe it's a night work and things like that. So women tend not to earn more than men in that kind of situation. So wage theft is also another issue, because I mentioned to you that women do not tend to report exploitation. So from our work with women, these women, the deduction of wages, or the unlawful deduction of wages, happens for over a period of years before the women actually makes a complaint. It's a very, very prolonged time before they actually make a complaint. So the wage theft is long. It's really, really long compared to men. Men, like maybe after 5 months, 6 months, they make a complaint, but women will wait. Wait because they cannot go back. Wait because they got too many mouths to feed. Wait because they have already normalized that kind of exploitative situation. So this kind of situation does happen when it comes to women in terms of wage theft. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sumitha. I want to go back to Marilyn to touch briefly on the review of the DACA principles. And this review is actually in the implementation guide. But Marilyn, for us, it was a long overdue exercise, and we're very glad that you were up for the challenge. What were some of the main gaps that you found when doing that, undertaking that gender review? And why do you think it's important that standards, whether they are voluntary or mandatory, take into consideration the gender lens?
Yeah, perhaps I'll take the second question first. I think as we've outlined this morning, we see that there are very particular challenges that face women migrant workers that are different from the challenges that face men, or they're a similar challenge but with different characteristics. So that's why standards like the DACA principles need to have that gender lens, because otherwise it's just not particularly thought about. As Sumitha and Anne have both said, the employers, people high up in the companies, people doing the recruiting are generally male. So these things are not particularly thought about and considered. Secondly, more women are beginning to migrate. There was a kind of dip around COVID, but that is a trend that's set to continue. So, you know, women migrant workers they will not be a minority. Some of them are migrating with families, some of them are migrating independently, and obviously in some jobs, in some roles, they're already a majority. So we need to take them into account. When we look through the principles, there were a range of, I think the way I'd frame it is really opportunities to think more about women migrant workers. So some of it was around issues I've already covered. So things around decent work and providing decent work, and that being considered as a kind of central mechanism for protecting women. Some of it was more specific. So some of it really got into kind of company policies around, say, access to healthcare, accommodation standards, payment of wages, human rights due diligence. Obviously, that's an area where there's been a great deal of focus over the last decade. So I think that's a space where, you know, there's guidance out there already, and there's a real chance to build on that. Some of it was around, obviously we've touched this morning on, on the recruitment issue generally, and what needs to happen in recruitment, and the types of thinking that need to go on in recruitment. So really it was across all areas, and it was a very interesting exercise for us to go through. And I think it's great that we're able to launch this, just before International Women's Day. And I think, the principles now, they do set a high bar. They set a realistic and achievable bar for companies, but they set a high bar in terms of other standards. And I think that's really quite groundbreaking. So I'll be keen to see kind of the reaction to that, and the steps businesses start to take to implement those guidelines. I guess one final thought was just a kind of, a reminder that sadly on some issues, employer pays principle is widely accepted, but we're not really seeing that implemented. So, some of this stuff is not gender specific. It is really just about business doing the basics.
Thank you, Marilyn. Look, the questions are raining in. A lot of people are asking about the links to the report, so my colleagues should be putting that in the chat. You can also look on IHRB.org, and it should be easily accessible. I'm going to turn to the questions because there are some really good ones here. And the first one, I would say, is for you in a way. It's about how can women migrant workers be better supported in countries that are more suppressive of unions and civil society. What are the means for women to get access to information, grievance mechanisms, and just support in general?
Is that for me?
For Anne.
For Anne, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. It's very challenging for us to organize in the country of destination, but we are doing it with other nationalities, and hopefully we can do it as well with Bangladeshi workers, especially with the women. It's really because the things that Sandigan Kuwait and ICC is doing is it's not only teaching you how to assert your rights, but will guide you on how to do it in actual manner, you know, in a safe way. So I think it will be helpful if we can have an organization for women that will serve as a support system, because support system is, you know, it has a lot of impact, especially for women, that will that they can have the information that they need to know, especially the rights, especially how they can live decently in this country, especially in MENA region or GCC or in Kuwait, and also to be there, especially if they encountered some trouble, some problems with their employers or companies. So we are always supporting them. That's the only thing that I have in mind, organize, because there's no other, I think there's no other way to address the issues without organizing the community themselves. Yes, I think that's it, Julie.
Thank you, Anne. And earlier you touched on kafala, and maybe just to explain for those who are not that familiar with kafala system, in very basic terms, is a system by which the employer is the sponsor of the worker. And so your visa, your employment, your ability to change jobs or to return to your country of origin or to have breaks or holidays is all dependent on the approval of the employer. This is quite common in some GCC countries. But I also think it's important to highlight that the challenges that we're talking about here today are not exclusive to the Middle East, to Asia, or, you know, developing countries. I think it's very important to say that in Europe, where I am at the moment, in the UK, where IHRB colleagues and Marilyn are, we are struggling with very similar problems of very high recruitment fees being paid by workers, inability to change jobs, etc. So this is a global problem, and we shouldn't just, you know, assume that this is a problem of developing countries, because it's not. There are a lot of questions about the role of governments. There's a question about corruption, which I think is very important. Also, the role of countries of origin and destination and their responsibility. So Marilyn, with the 5 Corridors project, you looked mainly at the role of governments, right? And their responsibility. So can you talk a little bit more about that role and that responsibility, but also what business can do and the leverage they have to influence some of those governments to improve their regulation and enforcement and practices in general, both when it comes to corruption, which we know is a very large problem, but also regulation, migration regulation in general.
Sure. So obviously it's governments that enable people to enter a country. You know, labour migration would not happen without government permitting that. So our position is that governments have primary responsibility for protecting migrant workers who are in the jurisdiction. The way that labour migration regimes are organised, we've talked about the kind of extreme examples of the kafala system, but as Julia says, you know, we encounter similar problems here, are generally very restrictive for migrant workers. So I think destination governments use migrant workers to plug gaps in the labour market. You know, we're seeing that here, where there's, you know, there are shortages for particular reasons, you know, either in Europe because of aging populations, we're seeing that more and more, or because there are particular types of jobs that, as the population becomes better educated, people move away from certain types of jobs. So in agriculture, that's a classic in Europe. Very difficult to get Europeans doing agricultural labour. So we're heavily reliant on migrant workers. And I think when that happens, there's a tension between kind of not particularly wanting to encourage migration, but at the same time needing migrants. And I think really the contribution of migrant workers to economies needs to be much better recognised, and they need to be protected properly by labour laws. Too often we see really a separate labour law regime, effectively, you know, a curtailed labour law regime that does not adequately protect migrant workers. So that, I think, is where the responsibility of government sits. And as I said, our position is that destination states are in the strongest position to regulate what's happening. In terms of what businesses can do, I think obviously engaging with government, engaging with civil society organisations. I mean, businesses lobbying for strengthened labour regimes may sound kind of slightly perverse, but those labour regimes can also, to a degree, protect businesses. They can protect them from reputational risk. They establish a clear framework for businesses to operate under. Here we have laws around modern slavery. If businesses are found to be involved in that, it can be seriously damaging for them. So kind of having a clear framework in place can help businesses. And I think businesses kind of, you know, thinking about those issues and thinking about what a level playing field can do, because when businesses are dealing with kind of being undercut or kind of a lack of clarity over who is responsible for covering the costs of labour migration, that's when corruption can emerge. That's when irresponsible actors can find a space. So for business, you know, clarity around labour standards is crucial, I would say.
Thank you, Marilyn. And it's worth noting also the Montreal recommendations, right, that address the role of governments in improving labor migration governance and protection for workers. So maybe my colleagues could put a link both to the 5 Corridors project in the chat and also the Montreal recommendations, so that participants have all these resources in one place. Look, of course, we're talking here about the role of business and governments and recruitment agencies, but I think it would be an oversight not to touch on domestic workers. Our focus for this report is business and responsible recruitment, which is not always a direct link to the issue of domestic workers, because we're talking about private employers in private households. But we know that when we're talking about women migrant workers and the protection of their rights, domestic workers are still the ones facing the most abuses and violations because of the hidden nature of their work and the difficulties also in accessing their rights. Also, often they are protected or they fall under a different category of legislation, sometimes no legislation at all. So Sumita, if you can just touch on some of those challenges faced by domestic workers and women migrant workers in those jobs, regardless of the country where they are working, and what do you see in your day-to-day work as well?
In terms of domestic work, because the worker is at home, the home can be in the city or whatever, but the worker is quite isolated in the home. And of course, there are employers who do not allow the workers out of the house, even if it's on their day off, on their rest day. And then they also have to sometimes work in multiple houses. This is something that we commonly see in a lot of countries, also in Southeast Asia as well. And also the fact that the women that come for domestic work have an age. So we know that, example, in Malaysia, the workers that come to Malaysia must be between 18 to 45 years of age. But when it comes to domestic work, it's from 85 to anything. So we see a lot of women sometimes living here for a very, very prolonged time, domestic workers, and then they don't go back home. And sometimes by the time they go back, domestic workers go back to their country of origin, they already passed their prime age of maybe getting married or having children. And this can cause a lot of stigma to the worker, to the domestic worker as well. So that is one social aspect that that has not been addressed by many countries. So we always say that after a certain age, I think that the worker should go back, or the worker should be given the freedom to go back. Because housework is there is no end to looking after a home. So that the worker should not be staying in that house until she's 60 or 70 years old because she's needed there. So that is something that the government has not taken into consideration. In terms of domestic work also, I mean, there are certain governments like will give some have given some sort of like restriction or regulation saying that only the worker that comes to the house can only do one type of job. So if she's here to look after an old person, then she can only look after that. Or she can only look after the children. That person can only do that. But then who is checking? Who's going into these homes to find out whether the women are actually doing the work that they've been brought to do? And we always think that it is always a good policy to have where when the worker is renewing their work permit, when the employer is renewing their work permit, or when the worker is passport is being renewed, that is a time that embassies should have some sort of interaction with the workers, or the labor department should have some sort of interaction with the workers. Other than the employer. It's so difficult to reach workers when they are in the homes of the employer and where they do not have the day off. So these are certain things that we see in terms of domestic worker. Of course, there are domestic workers and there are homes that are not equipped to have domestic workers. Example, they may just have a 2-bedroom house, or they may just have a 3-bedroom house, but they'll have children, they'll have these people, and then they don't have a place for the domestic workers. And that also creates a problem for the domestic worker to have a good sleep in the house, to have a proper place to sleep. So these are some of the common complaints that we get from the workers as well. Sexual harassment is also very rife. It's not only from the employer, it can be also from the children that they look after when they become adults. It can be also from other people that come into the homes, But then again, like what I mentioned just now, it is not so easy for the women to come out and make that complaint because it's in the home and there is no proof, And secondly, they have to bear that stigma. And we have time and time we have seen when we want to send a domestic worker home, the first thing that the family will ask us, why is she coming home? Did she face some sort of sexual harassment? But she can't come back to this village, then everybody will know, she's going to be creating a bad name for us. So there are many, many instances where we could not send the domestic worker home, but we had to send her elsewhere. So these are certain things. But having said this, of course the domestic workers are not in the supply chain, they're not. But I always felt that companies can have a role in ensuring that their employers or their workers or their employees who have domestic workers also treat their domestic workers with respect. Because I've seen many situations where the employee maybe is behaving like a Karen somewhere, or maybe is doing some animal abuse, and the company takes action against the worker for something he has done outside the working hour. you know. So the company thinks that, okay, because he's my worker and he has done something outside working hour and it's all over the media or whatever it is, so I'm still responsible for that worker. I'm still responsible for my employee. But so why does that not apply to domestic workers? So I feel that maybe somehow we can push employers also to take some sort of responsibility about the workers, that the domestic workers that their employees employ. That could be one way to bring some sort of perspective. Yeah, so that's what I would like to see.
Thank you, Sumita. That's exactly where I was going with my question. So I'm glad you touched on the role of employers and business as well. Look, we have an incredible amount of questions coming in and some really good ones. We're almost at time. There is one that I would love you, Marilyn, to reply to very quickly if you can, which is about restrictions, right? A number of countries impose restrictions on women's ability to migrate, whether it's age restriction, whether it's a sectoral restriction. Basically, the question is, do these work to protect women, or are they being used to just sort of replicate or continue this cycle of abuse? What's your view on that, Marilyn?
The evidence is that it's the latter. These restrictions don't work to protect women. In fact, they do the opposite. They expose them to greater risk. So, in terms of protection of women migrant workers, these types of restrictions, we would say, are not the way forward. The types of protections that are needed are the ones that Sumita and I have talked about this morning. So that's adequate information prior to departure, implementation of the employer pays principle, and adequate regulation of recruitment so that people are not paying fees, measures to promote gender equality in the workplace, and labour laws that properly protect women migrant workers, access to grievance mechanisms that take into account the particular issues that face women, and access, if necessary, to grievance mechanisms once people have returned home. It may be that they've experienced issues just prior to departure and they've perhaps been kind of forced to leave, and that needs to be remedied as well. And those measures are going to be much more effective in protecting women than attempting to impose restrictions on their movement and on their employment.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. Sumita, Anne, do you want to come in on that? We have a couple of minutes.
Sorry, on what point?
On the restrictions on women's ability to migrate and whether they protect women or not.
Yeah. So this protectionist policy is something I'm so against, because we work with a lot of women in this country and we see a lot of falsified documents. Women's age is, they're put as they are older, or they don't, they have to have a consent from their families, but it's all falsified documents and things like that. So and it becomes a problem when they have to go back because the age is not right, or they do not have the required permission, so to speak, from their family, and then the family will report them for runaways in the country and things like that. So this protectionist policies actually does not work. And one of the worst things that a lot of countries does is, if there's some problem that happens in the country of destination, they'll put a travel ban, and a lot of time we see a travel ban on domestic work. But they don't understand that women they don't know about the travel ban. The women don't know about the protectionist policies. So they will find some ways to leave the country, or the agents will find some way to bring them out of the country. So I'm totally against this kind of bans and also this kind of protectionist policies. What we should do is to address the harm that the women will face in the country of destination. And one of the ways I would always recommend is that the recruiter must have the responsibility to do a due diligence on the employer that they are contracting with to send the worker there. You know, it's the recruiter that washes his hands and said, I don't know anything about this employer. But how can you not? You are taking somebody from a foreign country and putting them in another country under the care of this person. How can you not have that duty of care to ensure that this person is suitable to look up to employ this women migrant? You know, so this is what we want, that the agency take responsibility to ensure that this company is whether it's a registered company, is it what kind of business it's doing, what is their track record, do interviews with the existing workers, things like that, and then you can send workers to that company. I remember that at one point there was embassies here in Malaysia who used to go and visit the companies before they give the approval for them to recruit the nationals from their country. And actually that worked quite well, because they can actually go to the premises and look and see whether this premises had the necessary work environment, it had women, and they will interview workers there. So if the embassies got there's only so many people that can work in the embassy, but they took it upon themselves to do that kind of. And so we must put that kind of responsibility on the agents. The agents must hold a little bit more, must do a little bit more duty of care, and also must be more responsible in terms of recruitment. So I think that would be my main point to bring forward. Thank you.
Look, thank you so much. We're at time. We still have questions coming in. We still have 135 people online. It's been a real pleasure to share this panel with you. I learned so much from the three of you. And I just wanted to end on a note to say that I agree, Sumita. Women don't need to be protected. Our rights need to be recognized and respected. We need to be valued. We need to be celebrated. And we need to be seen in all of our humanity and potential, because women are amazing. Happy International Women's Day tomorrow. Let's keep fighting. And thank you so much for attending. Thank you.